I heard my salary turned into a joke before it ever became a problem. You know how much she costs us, a man said, laughing lightly. The way people laugh when they want others to agree with them, enough to fund an entire team. The words drifted through a half-open glass door as I walked past the executive floor. I didn't stop. I didn't look in. I already knew the voice. Evan Rowe, recently promoted, recently confident, recently dangerous. I had spent 12 years at Ardent Horizon Group, quietly building the operational systems that kept our regulatory engine from collapsing under its own complexity. I wasn't flashy. My title, Senior Systems and Risk Architect, never appeared on earnings calls, but my models were the reason 3 federal audits cleared without escalation. My frameworks were the reason our largest institutional clients trusted our reporting without question. None of that fits neatly into a salary slide. Inside the room, I heard papers shuffle, numbers displayed without context, raw compensation figures stripped of everything they were tied to. No mention of the contracts my work stabilized. No mention of the clauses written around my role. Just a number meant to shock. I kept walking. When I joined Ardent Horizon, it was still founder-led. Decisions were debated, not declared. Systems were designed with memory fail-safes, redundancies, human judgment layered over automation. I was hired not because I coded faster than others, but because I understood how systems failed quietly. That culture didn't survive the growth. Executives rotated, power centralized, and Evan arrived polished, articulate, obsessed with efficiency optics. He spoke in abstractions, optimization, streamlining, cost realignment, words that sound intelligent until you realize they're shields against responsibility. He started asking me questions that sounded harmless. Are these legacy controls still necessary? Couldn't this be automated under a leaner structure? I answered carefully, briefly, and I documented everything. Because when people begin calling you too expensive, they're not questioning your value. They've already decided the outcome. What Evan Rowe didn't understand, what none of them understood, yet was that my compensation wasn't a number. It was a reflection of where I sat inside the architecture, and removing me wasn't an operational choice. It was a trigger. As Christmas approaches, I hope you're finding a little space to slow down, whether that means quiet mornings, time with family, or simply catching your breath after a long year. Whatever your plans are this season, please take care of your health first. Nothing we build, earn, or prove ever matters more than that. I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? And how are you spending these days leading up to Christmas if this story resonates with you? Consider subscribing so we can continue it together, because what happened next is where everything truly began to unravel. By the time Evan's questions started circulating beyond my desk, the tone inside Ardent Horizon had already shifted. People stopped asking why systems existed. They only asked how much they cost. I'd seen that phase before. It usually arrives right after a company convinces itself it's too mature for caution. The founders were gone by then, replaced by operators who treated stability like an inherited trait instead of something actively maintained. What most people never understood about my role was that I didn't manage tools. I managed dependencies. Every reporting engine, every compliance gate, every client-facing risk disclosure ran through layers I'd designed over a decade. Layers that assumed humans would eventually make bad decisions. My job was to make sure those decisions didn't cascade. That kind of architecture doesn't announce itself. When it works, nothing happens, no alerts, no emergencies, just quiet continuity. Silence makes executives nervous. Evan started calling my work maintenance. That word spread faster than any rumor. Maintenance implies something old, replaceable, something that can be deferred without consequence. He repeated it in meetings with a casual shrug, like he was describing outdated software instead of living systems tied to contracts worth billions. What he never reviewed, what no one asked me to walk them through, were the agreements written around those systems. Years earlier, during a strategic acquisition that pulled Ardent Horizon into a new regulatory tier, my role had been redefined under a special transition framework, not a golden parachute, Not a vanity clause, a continuity safeguard, at the time. Legal insisted on it. Too many critical functions. Too much institutional memory concentrated in one architecture. The clause wasn't dramatic. It was buried. Almost forgettable. That's how the most powerful clauses usually are. As Evan's review gained momentum, I noticed small changes. My access logs were being pulled. Internal usage metrics requested without context. Overlapping role analyses quietly commissioned. No one spoke to me directly. That's another pattern I've learned to recognize. When conversations about your future happen without you in the room, the decision has already been rehearsed. I didn't panic. Panic is loud. Panic leaves traces. Instead, I prepared. I updated my documentation, time-stamped everything, verified contractual language with my attorney quietly, professionally, without accusation. I didn't confront Evan again. People like him interpret warnings as challenges. He wanted a clean narrative, overcompensated role, streamlined future, applause at the end of a slide deck. What he didn't understand was that my presence at Ardent Horizon wasn't symbolic. It was structural. And structures don't disappear when you stop believing in them. They fail when you remove the wrong load-bearing piece. And he was already reaching for it. The meeting invite arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped urgent but disguised as routine. Operational alignment review. Executive floor. Full leadership attendance. I recognized the choreography immediately. These meetings are never about alignment. They're about permission, getting everyone in the room just long enough to make a decision feel collective. Even when it isn't. I took my usual seat. Same chair I'd occupied for years. Same sightline to the screen. Same quiet awareness of how much of the room's confidence rested on systems no one could explain anymore. Evan stood at the front, remote in hand, posture rehearsed. He smiled the way people do when they believe they've already won. He spoke for 12 minutes without saying anything specific. Agility, modernization, resource efficiency. Then the slide appeared. Phase 3. Structural optimization, sunset systems, architecture, oversight. Estimated annual savings, $800,000. No name, just the function. I felt the room lean forward, not toward me, but away. Executives avoiding eye contact. Legal too, still. HR pretending to take notes. Evan glanced at me. Just briefly. The way you look at an item on a checklist before ticking the box. We're not questioning past contributions, he said smoothly. But the firm has evolved. That was my cue. I stood slowly. Not to argue, not to defend myself. I reached into my bag and placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of the chief operating officer. Inside was my resignation, effective immediately. I removed my badge and set it on top. Metal against wood. The sound sharper than I expected. No one spoke. The silence stretched, dense and unfamiliar. Evan laughed, lightly. There's no need to be dramatic. We can discuss transition. But legal had already opened the envelope. I watched the general counsel's face change in real time. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. She didn't look at me. She looked at Evan, then back at the page. Oh no, she whispered. Not to the room. To herself. The COO turned pale. He flipped to the second document, clipped inside contract language, highlighted in yellow. Dates annotated. Council representation noted. The resignation wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Evan's confidence cracked. She resigned. He said too quickly. This doesn't apply. No one answered him, because the slide was still on the screen. Sunset systems, architecture oversight, termination by restructuring, documented, presented, recorded. The trigger had already been pulled. I pushed my chair back and stood. Thank you for the opportunity, I said. Calmly, I wish you stability, as I walked out. I heard the scrape of chairs, hurried whispers. Someone urgently dialing legal. The door closed behind me with a soft click. That sound, the quiet finality of it, was the moment Ardent Horizon crossed a line it wouldn't be able to uncross. They just didn't know it yet. If you understand the true meaning of this passage, please comment one sentence. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone was already vibrating. I didn't look at it. There's a specific window after a decision like that, too early for consequences, too late for denial. I knew what was happening upstairs without being there. Legal teams don't panic loudly. They panic methodically. The first emergency meeting would have started within the hour. Not about me. About exposure. Ardent Horizon ran on confidence, client confidence, regulator confidence, internal confidence that the systems humming beneath the surface were permanent. But permanence is an illusion built on continuity, and continuity is contractual. That afternoon, access permissions tied to my role automatically shifted to unsupported status. I hadn't disabled anything. I didn't need to. The system was designed to protect itself when ownership clarity disappeared. Compliance dashboards froze. Not offline frozen. That's worse. Frozen systems raise questions. By early evening, external counsel was looped in. Then finance. Then the board liaison who never attended meetings unless something had already gone wrong. I know this because a former colleague texted me 2 words. They're scrambling. By nightfall, the first client inquiry arrived not to me, but to Ardent's compliance inbox, a quiet question about who was now certifying quarterly risk disclosures tied to a multi-jurisdictional fund. There was no answer. Another message followed from a European partner, asking whether model continuity provisions were still satisfied under the new structure. Those provisions referenced my role explicitly, not my name, but the function I held. Functions matter more than people and contracts. Inside Ardent Horizon, Evan was likely arguing semantics, that I resigned, that nothing had technically changed, that legal language could be interpreted. But contracts don't interpret themselves. They execute. The clause I'd confirmed weeks earlier wasn't punitive. It was protective, written during an acquisition when institutional memory was deemed too critical to lose without guardrails. If my role ended without a defined transition window or buyout approval, a compensation acceleration triggered automatically, deferred compensation, equity multipliers, performance-indexed adjustments. The numbers weren't dramatic on paper. They became dramatic when indexed to current valuation. By midnight, finance had run the scenario. By morning, they ran it again and again. Each time, the number grew. What none of them had prepared for was the secondary effect. The moment ownership ambiguity touched compliance tools, audit assurances weakened. When assurances weaken, clients hesitate. When clients hesitate, revenue projections wobble. Confidence erodes quietly at first. I woke the next morning to 3 missed calls from numbers I recognized but didn't answer. I forwarded them to my attorney instead. She replied with 1 sentence. They're officially exposed. I made coffee, sat by the window, let the day begin without me, somewhere downtown. A company that once laughed at my salary was learning line by line, clause by clause, that silence, when ignored, compounds faster than interest. The number didn't arrive all at once. It crept. At first, Ardent Horizon treated the situation like a public relations inconvenience, something that could be managed with language and patience. Executives love to believe time is neutral. It isn't. Time favors whoever prepared. By the 3rd day, finance had escalated the issue to the board. Not formally, not yet, but the spreadsheets were circulating. Exposure models, worst-case projections, each version slightly worse than the last. My attorney kept me updated in fragments. No details I didn't already understand, just confirmation that the mechanisms were moving exactly as designed. The clause didn't just accelerate deferred compensation, it indexed it against market valuation and performance benchmarks tied to stability metrics. Stability metrics, Ardent Horizon was now failing. That's the part Evan never learned. When you build systems to survive stress, those same systems become unforgiving when stress is introduced artificially. By midweek, the exposure crossed 9 figures. That's when the phone calls changed tone. No more casual check-ins, no more quick chats. The messages were short, restrained, careful. Can we discuss options? Is there a path to resolution? I didn't respond. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes leverage inside the firm. Tension bled outward. Departments were told to freeze discretionary spending. Bonuses were quietly delayed. A scheduled acquisition briefing was postponed, pending internal review. No announcement, just absence. Clients noticed. A long-standing institutional partner requested clarification on reporting continuity. Another paused a renewal not canceled. Just paused. That pause alone cost Ardent Horizon millions in projected revenue. By Friday, the number stabilized, $1.8 billion. That was the combined exposure, accelerated compensation, contractual penalties, client churn risk, valuation impact from delayed deals. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was an overnight recalculation of the company's worth. The board convened an emergency session that evening. I wasn't there, but I could picture it clearly. The closed blinds, the quiet room, the realization settling like fog. Someone would have asked the obvious question, how did we miss this? The answer was simple. They never asked what my role actually was. They only asked what it cost. Evan reportedly argued, until his voice cracked, that the clause was excessive, that it wasn't intentional, that no one could have predicted this scale. Legal didn't argue back. They didn't need to. Contracts don't care about intention. They care about execution. Late that night, my attorney forwarded me a single sentence from external counsel representing Ardent Horizon. The board is seeking immediate resolution. I read it once, then set my phone down. They had finally stopped laughing. Many people listen past this part, but if you stayed, you know it matters. The board didn't reach out to me directly at first. They never do. Instead, they called my attorney. Then their attorney called another attorney. Then a conference call appeared on a calendar that didn't include Evan. That omission told me everything. When people are removed from meetings, it's rarely about accountability. It's about containment. By the time the board formally convened, the situation had outgrown internal management. This wasn't a personnel issue anymore. It was a governance failure, one that auditors, regulators, and institutional investors would eventually ask about in detail. The first thing the board demanded was a timeline. Legal walked them through it step by step. The restructuring slide, the recorded meeting, the resignation timestamp, the clause activation. Each moment documented, each trigger clean. There was no ambiguity to debate. What shocked them wasn't just the clause itself, it was how connected it was. My role wasn't isolated. It was referenced directly or indirectly in continuity assurances across multiple client agreements. Those agreements had cross-default language. One disruption created leverage in another, and another. That's how risk compounds when architecture is misunderstood. One board member reportedly asked if I could be temporarily reinstated to halt the cascade. Legal shut that down immediately. Once triggered, the clause didn't pause. It resolved either through execution or escalation. Anything else created new liabilities. That's when the word overnight started appearing in their language. Overnight exposure, overnight revaluation, overnight loss. It wasn't hyperbole, it was math. By the next morning, the company's internal valuation models had been revised downward. Pending deals were flagged as uncertain. A credit facility renewal was quietly delayed, all because one role had been dismissed as too expensive. Evan, I was told later, tried to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, a communication failure, a procedural oversight. The board didn't correct him. They didn't need to. Oversights that cost $1.8 billion don't get reframed. They get recorded. My attorney received a formal offer that afternoon. Structured, polite, carefully worded to avoid admitting fault. It wasn't enough. Not because I wanted more, but because the clause didn't allow for half measures. Partial resolution created additional penalties. That was intentional. The clause was designed to prevent exactly this kind of delay. They had built the trap themselves years earlier. I spent that afternoon doing something remarkably ordinary. I went for a walk, bought groceries, lived in the quiet space created by preparation. By evening, a second offer arrived, revised, closer. My attorney smiled when she read it. "They're not negotiating anymore," she said. "They're trying to stop the bleeding." I looked out the window as the sun dipped behind the skyline of a company I no longer belonged to. They had finally read the fine print, and they understood it perfectly. The call came late in the evening, long after offices had emptied and certainty had worn thin. It wasn't Evan. That mattered. The number belonged to the board's lead independent director, a man whose name rarely appeared anywhere public. People like him exist to step in when confidence collapses. I let it ring once before answering. His voice was steady, practiced. "Naomi, thank you for taking the call." He didn't apologize, not yet. Apologies come after alignment. He spoke about respect, about oversight, about how the board had been briefed incompletely, language designed to distance themselves from a decision they had technically approved. I listened without interrupting. Then he arrived at the point. "We'd like to resolve this quickly, in a way that reflects your contributions and minimizes damage." Minimizes damage. That phrase told me they had finally accepted reality. The damage was already done. What remained was how visible it would become. My response was calm. "My counsel has already outlined the terms required for resolution." Silence. Just long enough to confirm he was reading. "Yes," he said. "We've reviewed them." There it was. The acknowledgement. He didn't ask me to return. He didn't suggest consulting. He didn't dangle a title or gesture toward reconciliation. He knew better, instead. He asked one question. "If we execute this fully, cleanly, does the cascade stop?" It was a fair question. I respected that. "Yes," I said, "if executed within the window." Another pause. "We'll proceed," he said. The call ended without ceremony. The next 48 hours moved faster than the previous 2 weeks combined. Funds were reallocated, credit lines adjusted, internal memos drafted and rewritten until they said nothing at all. Executives learned their incentive pools were being restructured. Bonuses shrank. Some vanished entirely. The cost had to come from somewhere. Evan's name appeared less frequently in internal correspondence. Then not at all. Officially, he wasn't removed, he was repositioned. A strategic role without authority or access. A way to sideline without escalating further risk. That decision wasn't about fairness. It was about optics. When the final paperwork was signed, my attorney sent me a single message, executed in full, cascade contained. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Victory isn't loud when it's earned this way. There's no rush, no celebration, just the quiet certainty that the system behaved exactly as designed. A week later, Ardent Horizon issued a carefully worded internal note about organizational learning and legacy awareness, the kind of language companies use when they don't want to explain what really happened. No one mentioned my name. They didn't need to. The balance sheets already had. After the paperwork settled, the world didn't rush back in the way people expect it to. There were no interviews, no sudden headlines, no victory lap. That kind of noise belongs to people who need validation. I didn't. What followed was quieter and far more consequential. Within days, discreet messages began arriving. Not recruiters, not headhunters, principals, founders, chairs of firms who understood exactly what had happened without needing it explained. They didn't ask why I left Ardent Horizon. They asked what I had built. One conversation stood apart. It wasn't flashy, no promises, no branding decks. Just a simple question from a managing partner at North Shore Continuum. A firm known for stepping in when regulatory complexity threatened to paralyze growth. "We don't need you to rebuild what you did," he said. "We need you to design what no one else sees coming yet." That was enough. I joined as a partner, not an employee. Not an advisor, a partner, with authority written clearly, this time, in ink that didn't rely on memory or goodwill. The work began immediately. Within weeks, we onboarded 2 institutional clients who had quietly paused their relationship with Ardent Horizon. No announcements, no press releases, just transitions executed with precision. The systems I designed at North Shore weren't replicas. They were evolutions, leaner, smarter, built with the assumption that leadership would eventually fail its own curiosity. That assumption is the most realistic design principle I know. I didn't speak publicly about what happened, not because I couldn't, but because stories like this don't need narrators. They leave traces. People follow them back if they care enough. Inside Ardent Horizon. Change arrived slowly, too slowly to undo the damage. Internal audits expanded. Legal added layers. Committees formed to ensure comprehension of inherited contractual risk. The phrase made me smile when I heard it. They were learning the vocabulary I'd spoken fluently for years. Evan disappeared from industry events. His name stopped appearing on panels. He hadn't failed publicly, but he had been revealed privately. In this world. That's worse. As for me, life simplified. I woke earlier, slept better, spent less time explaining myself. When I walked into rooms now, no one asked how much I cost. They asked how much risk I could remove. That difference matters. One evening, months later, I received a brief message from someone still inside Ardent Horizon. "You were never too expensive." It read, "We just didn't know what we were paying for." I didn't reply. Understanding that late doesn't reverse outcomes, but it does complete the lesson. The $1.8 billion was easy to measure. It showed up in revised forecasts, delayed expansions, and evaluation that never fully recovered its previous momentum. Analysts would later attribute it to market conditions and internal realignment. That was the public story. The real cost was quieter and far more enduring. Inside Ardent Horizon, something fundamental had shifted. Not the org chart, not the branding, the psychology. People stopped trusting simplifications. Every proposal was questioned. Every restructuring reviewed by legal with a level of scrutiny that slowed everything down. Decisions that once took days now took weeks. Momentum bled out through caution. That's the tax of ignorance. Once paid, it never fully goes away. Teams began documenting obsessively, not because they were diligent, but because they were afraid. Afraid of being the next unseen, load-bearing structure someone dismissed as too expensive. Turnover followed, not dramatic exits, strategic ones, the kind where institutional memory leaves quietly and doesn't return. Clients noticed the difference, not in performance metrics, but in tone. Calls became formal, conversations less collaborative. Trust, once fractured, doesn't announce its departure. At North Shore Continuum, we watched it happen from a distance. We didn't pursue Ardent's clients aggressively. We didn't need to. When systems weaken, people look for stability instinctively. They found us. One former Ardent partner told me something I haven't forgotten. They used to explain risk. Now they apologize for it. That's what happens when you confuse cost-cutting with understanding. Evan's career didn't implode. It stalled. He became careful, quiet, invisible. In some industries, that's survivable. In his, it's terminal. No one blamed him publicly, but no one trusted him privately either. And trust is the only currency that compounds in leadership. As for the board, they implemented safeguards, mandatory reviews, independent oversight, layers upon layers designed to prevent another oversight. They called it progress. It wasn't. It was penance. Progress requires humility before damage, not after. Months later, during a routine review at North Shore, I caught myself smiling at a familiar clause in a new contract, a continuity provision, clear, direct, unmissable. I hadn't written it. Someone else had learned. That's the part no one talks about. Stories like mine ripple outward, quietly. Contracts get read more carefully. Roles get defined more precisely. Systems get questioned by people who used to ignore them. That's how change actually happens. Not through punishment, but through recognition. $1.8 billion was the price Ardent Horizon paid to learn something they could have learned for free. All it would have taken was curiosity and respect. In the end, the story wasn't about money. It never is. $1.8 billion was just the receipt the proof left behind after a much earlier failure. The real loss happened long before the meeting, long before the slide deck, long before my resignation envelope touched that table. It happened the moment they stopped asking why something existed and settled for asking how much it cost. I think about that often now. At North Shore Continuum, my workdays are quieter, not easier, just clearer. When something feels complex, people lean in instead of backing away. When a system resists simplification, that resistance is treated as information, not inconvenience. That mindset changes everything. I've watched younger leaders sit across from me, listening carefully, taking notes, not because they're afraid, but because they're curious. They want to understand what they're inheriting before they try to optimize it. That alone tells me the lesson traveled. Sometimes, late in the evening, I replay that moment, the sound of my badge touching the table. The pause before the consequences began unfolding. Not with pride, with clarity. I didn't win anything that day. I exited a system that had stopped seeing itself accurately. And systems that lose self-awareness don't collapse dramatically. They erode, quietly, expensively. Ardent Horizon still exists. Companies rarely disappear overnight. But it operates differently now, more guarded, less confident, slower to trust its own decisions. That's the lasting impact of learning the hard way. As for me, I carry one rule forward into every room I enter. If something seems expensive, ask what it protects. If a role seems redundant, ask what breaks without it. And if someone works quietly while everything runs smoothly, pay attention. They might be holding the entire structure upright without ever saying a word. I never needed an apology. I never needed recognition. The outcome spoke clearly enough. And if there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this story, it's this: value is rarely loud, leverage is rarely obvious, and the most dangerous mistakes are made by people who stop being curious too soon. If this story made you pause, even briefly, take that pause with you into your own work, your own decisions, your own contracts. Read carefully, ask better questions, protect your health, your time, and the systems that support you. And before you go, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? What part of this story stayed with you the most, if you choose to subscribe? Thank you. These stories continue because people like you recognize that quiet lessons matter. Because sometimes, that's how awareness spreads, one overlooked detail at a time. When this story ended, what stayed with me wasn't the number, it was the silence that came before everything broke. I learned that value isn't proven by how loudly you're defended, but by what collapses when you're gone. Sometimes the greatest strength is simply knowing what you hold, reading carefully, and trusting your preparation when the moment arrives. I'm curious, how did this story make you feel? Was there a detail that lingered with you longer than the rest? A moment that felt uncomfortably familiar? And where are you listening from right now as this year winds down? I genuinely wish you a warm, peaceful Christmas, one filled with health, rest, and people who truly see your worth. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. A like or share helps these stories reach others who may need them, and subscribing means you'll be here for the next one, quiet, honest, and just beginning, and just beginning, and just beginning.